So he starts this book off saying, you are in such trouble. And we read it lightly because those wrath words are far from us. We don't think about it often. But that's a very close, real word for these guys who are receiving. I wish there was a way for me to know what it is that you think of as dangerous and then use those words. Like, you're about to get it. You guys are in it. And then he spends that whole first 4 chapters really saying, like, you guys are in it. Some of you guys think you're not in it, and you're in it. It's coming, and it's coming hard. And that's the salvation that he's talking about right here. When he says, you call on the name of the Lord and you'll be saved, it is not a smaller salvation. And so that has some aspects that I'd love to talk about some other time, but we can't be preaching that God's going to save you from hurt toenails. In fact, Jesus promised that if you're following him, you're going to be persecuted. There's going to be pains worse than toenails to deal with. So we can gain the whole world in missions and give somebody the whole world. Pull them out of their broken family and put them in a good family and clean up their addictions and get their life straight. Get them to stop talking so bad. All those cuss words or whatever. And then they go to hell. And it's not worth it. This is real. There are priorities. And you might say, okay, I see here that the priorities that they call on the name of the Lord and be saved. And it seems pretty simple. Call on the name of the Lord, not just call on the name of the Lord, all, or everyone. ESV says everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. So it's pretty simple. And I just saw your video, and you were like, hey, we started this seminary. We're not out there asking people to call on the name of the Lord. You guys are training leaders. Well, I will tell you that it's not as simple as you think. And it matters how leaders lead. It matters how teachers teach, what preachers preach, what believers believe. It's very intentional what we do because we believe that all who call on the name of the Lord will be saved. But sometimes it's a different Lord. So let's just imagine this for a second. How easy is it to call on the name of the Lord? I hear people say sometimes, I don't want theology, I want the gospel. I actually hear that quite a bit here in the United States. It's a real common thing. I don't want theology, I want the gospel. So I ask them, what is the gospel? If they give me an answer, that would be theology. Right? If they give me a wrong answer, they're in danger. And this seems very silly, right? But if medicine, if I had to give somebody medicine, and it was 2 tablespoons, sodium bicarbonate, and 1 tablespoon vinegar. That's not good medicine. But if it was that was the only cure, and they did 2 tablespoons vinegar and 1 tablespoon sodium bicarbonate, they'll die. Now that happens, that's what Paul spent all these chapters beforehand saying. Don't think this, don't think this, don't think this, don't think this. Don't think it's pretty much you and a little bit God. Don't think it's pretty much God and a little bit you. Think that it's all God, all the cross, all Jesus dying, all this sacrifice, replacement, all this stuff. He's clarifying the gospel. He's building all this theology. Because if you believe wrong, there's dangers. So he's bringing it up and showing how it's not that simple. So when people say, why are you focusing so hard on this? I just want the gospel. I don't want theology. And I ask them what the gospel is. They'll say, call on the name of the Lord. That's what the gospel is. And I'll just ask, what is his name? Is it Allah? What is his name? And who is he? The Jehovah's Witnesses will really get people on this. They'll be like, actually, God's name is Jehovah. And they'll try to move you towards a different gospel. But who is this Lord that we're supposed to call on? What does calling mean? And what are we saved from? All these aspects Paul has been bringing up throughout Romans. And if we get this wrong, we get missions wrong. So it says, if we're going to understand this, we have to know who the Lord is. Should be Jesus. Don't get me wrong. But you go into other cultures and you say, call on the name of the Lord and you'll be saved. And I work with Ashore people in the jungle and they'll be like, the Lord is this river. Or the Lord is this great tree. Gosh. Sorry about that, guys. So that's a bad situation. But let's imagine that they agree with us. We're preaching the Lord is Jesus. Jesus is Lord. Right? Then you have to ask, who is Jesus? And I'm not messing around with you guys because we in this room do not all agree who Jesus is. And if you get farther out of this room, it starts to change quite a bit. Is he God? Is he not? What's his role? Was he a man? Was he not? In Ecuador, it's really common to ask somebody who Jesus is, and they'll be like, that's Mary's baby. And you'll be like, is he important? Why would he be important? He is important. Because he's Mary's baby. I mean, could you imagine being like direct heritage from Mary herself? Because Mary's Lord, and Jesus is her baby. And that's really common. Not everybody, but it's a really common view. In the United States, you might hear people say he's a great teacher. You might hear them say he's a prophet. You might have to question whether you're saved if you believe these things. Because that's not a gospel. If he's a great teacher, then he's giving you good teaching to follow, I imagine. In which case you would have to follow it. The thing is, there's a lot of unconverted churchgoers in the United States where we preach Jesus all the time. And the Jesus in their head is a different Jesus than what we're preaching. Sometimes Jesus is a tool that we can use to get what we want. I know you hear this a lot probably in the preaching that Jesus is not an ATM. And there's a real temptation to use Jesus to get something. Better family life, better communication, better parenting, whatever. I use you, Jesus, for this stuff. And then he's not Lord. He's the way to your Lord. And what is your Lord? Whatever you're trying to get from Jesus. And that's something to realize. If you want to figure out who your Lord is, you can look and say, what am I using Jesus to get? But instead, the view we should have is I use everything to get Jesus. And the reason I bring this up is because Luke 6:46, he tells them, why do you call me Lord and Lord, but you don't obey me? Or he said, a lot of people come in that day and say, look at all these things we did for you, Lord. And I'll say, I never knew you. So calling him Lord isn't enough. That's clear in the Bible. Why are you calling me Lord? I'm obviously not your Lord. So saying that Jesus is Lord is not enough. He has to be the real Jesus. Not one we made up, and that Jesus has to be our Lord, not a tool for us to use. And really, there's not one square inch of your life that Jesus has not declared his. Not one thought, not $1, not 1 minute watching a cat video on YouTube. It's his minute. And don't get me wrong, cat videos are great. And they're not simple. We're talking about wartime stuff. And we're like, you're watching a cat video? I'm not going to be that guy because I know what war is like. And if you are not having some fun, sometimes you'll lose your mind. In fact, have you ever read these books on missions, Insanity of God or Insanity of Obedience? They'll talk about these war-torn places and when they're pulling refugees out. One of the signs, markers of mental health is humor. Because if you can't laugh anymore, you've lost a bit of your humanity. Or C.S. Lewis was writing about fighting in the First War. And he made clear to everybody, you need to know this. Most of what we're doing in the trenches, World War I, people are dying, one of the nastiest wars ever. Most of what we're doing is like playing chess and drinking tea, talking about what's going on in the world, reading literature, because you're not always directly in gunfire. But you need to be ready for it. But you do need to laugh while you're waiting. And then when it gets into the fight, here's how the fight goes. Call on the name of the Lord and you'll be saved. So how can they call on him in whom they have not believed? So we're going to see this progression. How can they call on him in whom they've never believed? How are they going to believe if they've never heard? How are they going to hear if we don't preach? And how are we going to preach if we're not sent? And you can go through those steps to see how this mission happens, how the war is going on. And the believe one we're going to look at first, how will they call on him in whom they have not believed? So believe. That is a heart issue, just to clarify. Believing is not something you go out and do. Like I went out and I believed. It is heart level, it's not a ritual, we can't make somebody do it. Praying a prayer is not believing. Baptizing someone is not believing. These are all great things to do after one has believed. But it is not believing. Believing is something invisible, and that's why it's hard. They'll do membership interviews with you guys to try to figure out if you're a believer before you join the church, because you can say the Lord's Prayer, you can say the sinner's prayer, you can be baptized, you can do all kinds of stuff and not believe. That's just a reality. We have to believe. Realize that believing is not just having the right answers. James 2:19 teaches us that Satan has great theology. And why wouldn't he? He knows ins and outs of God. He's a better theologian than we are. But he hates it. He hates it. And that might be us too. We might be like, I like the church people. When I read this Bible, I hate it. It tells me to stop doing stuff that I love to do. That's a problem. And so because of that, because this whole believing thing is nebulous, a group of Anglicans, actually, solid guys though, in Australia have stopped using believe. They're even pushing for an English translation where we switch this one, because it's a bit of a difficult word, and start saying rely or trust. They're the Matthias Media guys. And they're saying that better clarifies what's going on, because you can know the answers and not hope in those answers at all. John Piper is trying to push to change it to believe. He'll always say in his sermons, he won't he'll say, you need to believe that Jesus is a treasure. Because if you just believe that he was, you're on par with the demons. If you believe he's God, you're on par with the demons. If you believe he was also man, you're on par with the demons. If you believe he had right answers, you're on par with the demons. But if you believe he's wonderful, if you believe that if you could just get more of him, things would be better. If you believe he's a treasure, that's what we're talking about in this situation. That's true belief. But how are they to believe if they don't hear? That's actually the next part of our passage. How are they to believe in him of whom they have never heard? And this really gets into mission strategy. This little section is a lot of my whole career in doing missions and training people in missions. There's a lot going on, because in order to hear, it doesn't just mean that noises are coming out. This requires understanding. If we're going to hear something, then believe it, we have to know what it is. That's pretty basic. And there's levels of why people don't hear this message. One of them, I can explain through a story of my government where I work. I live in Ecuador, and in the jungles of Ecuador, there's tribes. Powerful tribes would be Shuar and Achuar, and they don't obey the government for various reasons. They don't obey it. And one of the reasons that they don't obey the government is because the government doesn't talk to them. They don't know what the government wants. They have no idea. There's no access to it. You go far enough out, and they're in the jungle. Like, who's going to come? I remember one time I was talking to a guy in the mountains, an Ecuadorian guy, about some guys I work with in the jungle, and they do sansa and shrinking heads and things like that. And he's like, that's unacceptable. That's against Ecuadorian law. And I was like, they don't know that. I don't know if they're even considered themselves Ecuadorians, a lot of them. They're Shuar, they're Achuar. So that's a problem of access. The message has not arrived. This is a big problem in all of the world. People don't know all this stuff that you guys are learning right now. People don't know the stuff that James has been preaching for the last however long. Many Sundays. They don't have this message. So that's an access problem. But then there's language issues. We need to speak it in a way that they can understand. So if I were to say to you guys, Mule fai ujumi guape, chete kela muli yesu, akakwelela, amen? Yeah, you guys have no idea. I was preaching the gospel to you guys, them. But you don't know. And imagine if I went to Ecuador and preached the gospel in English. It would be the same effect. The same effect. You can't believe something you don't understand. And so that is not saving. That doesn't have the salvific effect that we're looking for. But even if you did understand, if you understood the message, it would take a little bit of time. There might be other considerations, like cultural issues. And I'd love to talk more about all these things. There's depths that you can go into, but there is cultural issues to understanding things. Like I know right now I'm wearing sandals. And there's a group of you guys that might say, this guy has nothing to say to me. All his stuff is garbage because he's wearing sandals. But then there's other people who are like, this guy's legit, he's real. This guy that talked to me, he's wearing sandals, right? Or I have 3 master's degrees and a doctorate in this stuff. Some of you guys will say, this guy has nothing to say to me, he's a weirdo. Other guys will say, no, that guy, he knows what he's talking about. And why? That's all your cultural understanding of who can authoritatively give a message. Do you need degrees? No. Do you need sandals? No. But what if you do have those? It doesn't matter. The message is either true or it's not. But in every culture, there's going to be certain things that will close your guys' ears. If I were up here with my middle finger raised to you guys the whole time, saying, something similar to give praise to God, but I was using my middle finger, you guys might not hear my message. This happens all the time in other cultures. All the time. We do things that unintentionally offend people greatly because our little ways of communicating things are not shared. So one thing that's really common in India, in artwork, is if you look one direction, you're evil. If you look another direction, you're good. Right? So if I got a felt board up here and I'm like, Jesus came and he died on the cross and he's looking one direction on my little felt board, they all know he's evil. If he's looking another direction, they all know he's good. But I don't know that unless I know the culture. And if I want to know the culture, I need to know the language. If I want to know the language, I have to study a long time. And then I got to spend a long time learning the culture. So these are just little issues. Some cultures equate truth. Time plus relationship equals truth. So if I come in and I just spend a little bit of time talking to you about this stuff, you're like, well, we'll see. We'll see if it's true. Because you also need time and relationship for these things to prove. And then there's that other issue. So we've gotten into they gotta believe, and to believe they have to hear, and to hear, the end of verse 14, the beginning of verse 15 says, how are they to hear without someone preaching? And how are they to preach unless they are sent? So we have preaching and sending. And this is part of the mechanics of missions because we've got 2 different kinds of missions workers. Now, God has a method for this stuff to happen, and there's a lot of confusion on this. So I want you guys to know that in missions, these 2 roles, the preachers and the senders, from Romans 14 and Romans 15, are both biblical roles, and they are equally important. So another John Piper thing, he always says, you can go, or you can send, or you can disobey. But a lot of people think that you can go or you can disobey, and those are your 2 options. And it's not. But you do have to go or you do have to send. You have to be taking part in this. And I want to ask you guys, which one is more important? Chew on it. I'll tell you guys, biblically, neither is more important. But I want you to chew on it in your heart. Which one of these is more important? Because you might have to change your thinking on some of this stuff. Now, I do want to clarify, not everyone is supposed to go, and part of your job as a church is to weed out who's supposed to be going. Are they qualified? Are they trained? Would I send them to do this stuff? It's usually in the Bible a very small percentage of the church that does get sent out. Like Paul and Barnabas, Silas. We'll set these guys aside and we'll send them out. Some people feel guilty for not going. I get done with this sermon, talking about this same stuff, or another sermon, similar stuff, and saying, you do not have to go, and they'll come up to me afterwards, like, I feel so bad. for not going on the mission field. And I'm like, well, are you a preacher here? Like, have you been practicing preaching or sharing the gospel? I was like, no. I just know I gotta go on the mission field. And I'm like, why are you thinking that? Because you're not even doing it here. So what makes you think that you would go and learn another language and do it well somewhere else? But there's something inside of us that elevates certain gifts. And I think you can see in certain churches, missionaries are very important. And that's not super biblical. They're not like up above people. But in other churches, missionaries mean nothing. We don't even care about it, but pastors are super important. Right? That's not biblical either. In other churches, we'll see things like missionaries and pastors are both kind of dumb, and people who make lots of money are super important. But I will tell you guys, all of what you guys are doing, all that you do, unless you're doing something sinful, is important. If nobody cleans the dishes, the world dies. If nobody cleans our counters, the world dies. If there's no hospitals, the world dies. If there's no food, the world dies. How am I supposed to preach to somebody who's dead? It doesn't work. God made a beautiful diversity. You read about it in Ephesians 2, you read about it in multiple letters, that Jesus is the head of the church. Not a pastor, not a missionary, not a theologian, none of that. Jesus is the head of the church, and the body is the members. And the body has different functions depending which part of the body it is. It could be the wrist, it could be the elbow, it could be the shoulder. But if the shoulder isn't working properly, this elbow doesn't work. And if the elbow is gone, the wrist is out of commission. The wrist is gone, the hands get out of commission. We need all these different members doing their different things in order to function. And that's what the church is. So it is not a sin to stay. It is a sin to do nothing. You need to be involved in God's mission in the whole world. You can be going or you can be staying, in which case you'll be sending, but take part in what's going on. Think about you as an individual, and also think about your church. Now, I can say from this church that this is the church that has been sending us since we went. So the church is active in this kind of activity. Think about where you are at in this process. But also remember, like I said, goers and senders equally important. And in wartime history, if you read a history of any war, a lot of the strategy is to destroy the supply line. A lot of the reason that wars are won is because of supply line. That's sending type of stuff, right? And you know how we're fighting against Russia right now, even though we won't go ahead and do it, is we're supplying arms to Ukraine. And at the same time, we're sucking supplies out of Russia. We're freezing their accounts. We're doing things to stop them. And that is making Ukraine have a chance in a battle. When you guys are sending missionaries, you're giving money to make them stay alive. And hopefully you're taking away money from governments or things that would be hurting them. In our situation, we don't have a government that hurts us. Ours is quite nice to us. But there is a very important sending aspect. Captain America, not usually, a great go-to for quotes, but when he was selling war bonds in the first Captain America movie, he said, every bond you buy is a bullet and the gun of your best guy, right? And that was trying to teach people, hey, you can help this war go along. But sending ammo isn't just what we need. It's good. Like, ammo needs to be there. These soldiers that I see on the mission field, empty computer labs, rooms full of clothes that have been donated, boxes of Bibles that have never been read because the people don't read, and essentially boxes of ammo that will never be shot. So what we need is not just ammo, but soldiers. Wars aren't won by weapons, they're won by soldiers. Soldiers. Not soldiers who go for 1 week and then don't go again for another year. Imagine if we did that in a war. Like, I'm going to spend a week legitimately fighting, but then the other 51 of this year, I got to rest. No, that's not going to work in a war type of situation. Imagine if a person like that wanted to date your daughter. I will talk to her 1 week a year, but then after that, she's got to kind of take care of herself. Like Jesus doesn't want that for his bride. We don't want that for our daughters. We need commitment. I say that because a big push in missions right now is to do things very, very short term. And very, very little commitment at all. Like, I'm not going to learn the language. I'm not going to live amongst you people. I'm not going to get in there. And I say that because our opposition, the other religions that are going against us, and they are going against us, are in it in the long game. They might say, I'll lose the battle. This week, these guys are going to dominate because they came in with a bus full of people. They're throwing money out like it's, and they win that week. But next week, we're still here. And that's what the Jehovah's Witnesses are saying. That's what the Muslims are saying. If you've ever heard that there's a world boom in Christianity, you might have heard this, like Asia's filled with churches. Africa's filled with churches. It would be interesting to go back in and check what the sermon is about. What are they preaching in these churches? What are they believing in these churches? Because that has a huge effect on what is called Christian, what should be Christian. And I can tell you, when we lived in Zambia, the Jehovah's Witnesses were there strong. And they were there for the long game. And they would come to your Baptist church and they'd ask you afterwards, hey, you guys study the Bible? We study the Bible. Let's get together. Let's study this thing. Like, oh, great. Yeah, we have no teachers around here. They came in for a week and they left. So they're like, okay, let's study the Bible. And then they're like, oh, you know what? It says right here, Jesus is the Son of God, which means he can't possibly be God, right? Because if you're not your son, they're like, oh, yeah, I guess that makes sense. And they're like, hey, you don't have a Bible, do you? I'll give you one. And they've got their own translations, New World Translation. It cuts out all the parts they don't like. It makes everything fit with what they're teaching. If those guys are in it for the long game, we go, no, I've heard all these reports, like these short-term trips are killing it. They come back, they planted 10 churches. I can tell you that it's very easy to say that. There's a guy who did his dissertation on Haiti, and what his numbers came out with is just Southern Baptist churches on short-term mission trips saved every man, woman, and child in Haiti 4 times in the 10-year period. Every man, woman, and child, because we're too light with what we're trying to save.